So without further ado, Dr. Jerrod Brown.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Bradley, for allowing me to be part of your wonderful training program. Welcome, everyone. I look forward to getting to know all of you during these next 5 trainings. And Michael and Bradley, please correct me if I'm wrong. I think we might be doing maybe some consultation at times too as a part of this series. But if you have any questions you think of during today's training, type it in the chat box. Michael, interrupt me anytime if we have questions coming in. And folks, if you think of any questions after the fact, my email address is on this first slide. Reach out anytime. More than happy to get back to you by email, jump on a phone call. I typically have a multitude of resources on most of these topics we're talking about, so I'm more than happy to share any supplemental learning materials with all of you. These are the trainings that encompass this series. These are the ones that I'll be doing remotely like this. So again, like Michael said, today is kind of a foundational day. I'm always concerned, to be honest with you guys, when I give a talk on like the prenatal world, sometimes if you're working with adult clients, you might start zoning out. You might start thinking this isn't related to the good work you're doing with adults, but this is so important to understand what went on during pregnancy, what happened during early childhood that now impacts your client's behavior in adulthood. And behavior could be prison, treatment, transportation, taking meds as prescribed, being able to interact with fellow members in their residence. So this is very, very important. Part 2 in the training, it's executive dysfunction. This is the CEO of the brain. If any of you develop goal plans, treatment plans, intervention plans, or anything to do with offender reentry, in the research literature, it talks about it's imperative to understand this topic because most clients who come out of prison have some level of executive dysfunction going on. That can impact decision making, problem solving, time management, organization, forgetting to show up to one's appointment to their therapist or probation officer, forgetting to take one's medications, big topic. If any of you work with clientele who have any kind of social skill limitations, that's what this 3rd training is going to be about, social cognition deficits. This relates to perspective taking deficits, empathy, moral reasoning. So if any of you have ever worked with folks who have like violent offender histories, individuals who've engaged in inappropriate sexual behavior, that this topic is going to be very important for you to be aware of. The 4th training in the series is alexithymia. If you believe the research, half your clients or more probably are dealing with this. Most professionals have never even heard of this term in my experience. Alexithymia is when your client really struggles with naming emotions, labeling emotions, making sense of emotions. Why should you care about that? Because this has been linked with more relapse on drugs and alcohol, more violent behavior, more physical, more mental health challenges. And in the research, it talks about untreated alexithymia being a risk factor for violent behavior. And the last training in this series is going to be hopefully a little interesting to you in terms of how does food and nutrition and food insecurity play into all of this? There's a ton of research that indicates that food insecurity quite high among folks who are on probation, ISR, people that have been in and out of prison. And why should you care about that? Because if a client is dealing with some level of food insecurity, nutritional deficiencies, malnutrition, maybe they drink a ton of sugar sweetened beverages, energy drinks, fast food, there's a lot of research to show that that can have a really profound impact on their mood and behavior and their energy levels and their memory. And it may be actually a factor that could contribute to criminal behavior. So that's a broad spectrum overview of what we're going to cover in this series. A lot of these topics are going to build on each other through this series. So you'll probably hear me talk about a lot of these topics over and over again in just different ways and different angles. Here's a copy of my brief professional biography. If you've never been to any of my trainings with different groups, I come at this from a professor. lens. I'm a professor. I teach classes at the undergrad, graduate, and doctorate level. Most of the classes I teach are in like criminal justice, forensic psychology, trauma, mental health related classes. I do a lot of trainings for a lot of different groups around the country. All the trainings I do now are remote like this. I do publish quite a bit. I have published original research studies as well. So you can go online and just type in my name and you can find all kinds of articles. I do go on a lot of podcast programs nationally and internationally. You can find a ton of those on YouTube if you're interested in some of these topics, if you do want to go deeper into it. Training description today, obviously, I think you guys might have this in advance because the slides were sent out beforehand and the training objectives. I just want to show you this slide so you know where I'm going to be coming from throughout this whole series. I also do a lot of consultation with different groups related to a number of different topics. I've consulted on homicide cases, sex offender cases, fire setting. I've consulted with group homes when clients have elopement behaviors, lots of mental health things going on, trauma histories, brain injuries, autism, fetal alcohol syndrome. What I have found helpful, just in my experience, is that by learning about these topics here, it has really helped me have a better understanding of complex human behavior, which can relate to delinquency, antisocial behavior, concerning behavior. Maybe some of these topics you've never heard of. By no means am I asking any of you to become experts in these topics, but I do believe if you can understand the basics of these terms and start to get an appreciation for the research on these topics, you will be in a much better position to develop an intervention, a goal plan, a treatment plan, or whatever kind of services you're providing that can help that client on more of a holistic level. Because most of these clients that you probably work with are not only dealing with some level of mental health impairment or behavioral health challenges, but a lot of these clients have had head trauma histories, nutritional deficiencies, in utero traumas, traumas that happened to them before they were even born. So it's very important we understand this. Throughout this training series, I'm going to really rely on the biosocial criminology research. And the reason why I do that is because I do believe this body of research can help us go a lot deeper into understanding complex human behavior. Some of the topics that fall under this umbrella are going to be related to nutritional deficiencies, biochemical abnormalities. Why should you care about that? What happens if you work with a client who skips breakfast every day and just pounds down the energy drinks and smokes a ton of cigarettes? That way of living may actually exacerbate behavioral problems and contribute to relapse on drugs and alcohol in some cases. We'll talk about all these topics throughout this series. These are a few of the biological risk factors found in the research literature that have been linked with violent behavior or concerning or deviant behavior. Again, these are big, big topics, but I want to just point out a few that I suspect you probably come into contact with all the time. And one of them is head injuries. The research indicates that as many as 50% or more of people who are in prison have head trauma histories. Most of the time it's undiagnosed. So when you're working with folks coming out of prison, it's imperative that you become head injury informed because at least half your clients probably have a head injury. And we'll talk a lot about head injuries throughout this series. The other field of study that's very similar to what we just spoke about in the last two slides is a field of study called neurocriminology. This is where I do most of my work now. I'm doing more writings on this and more consultation with different professionals on topics related to this. Where I'm at today, I could be wrong on this, but where I'm at today, I believe this field of study is the best what we have to really understand criminal behavior on a deep, deep level. Not just the family factors or the social factors or the environmental factors that contribute to criminal behavior, but also a lot of these biological and even genetic factors. I've done a couple podcasts you can find on YouTube on neurocriminology. If you have the time and you find this interesting, I really encourage you to take a look at those because I really dig deep in the weeds. And what this research literature indicates is if you can become informed about this field of study, you're going to be in a better position to understand behavioral dysregulation. I'm assuming most of your clients probably deal with some level of this. This could be self-control deficits. Have you ever worked with a client who just can't delay gratification, where they're just so impulsive and they don't think through their actions? Do you have clients that just engage in really weird, unusual, concerning behavior over and over and over again, and no matter how many treatments they go to, they just seem to make the same mistakes over and over again? This field of study can help us really understand the neurological, the brain-based components, and the biological factors that may be driving the bus with some of these things. And this field of research also focuses on interventions that can help prevent these things from happening, diagnosing the root causes of crime. And I'm not asking you like to diagnose like a psychologist would, but just understanding all these variables that you may see in some of your clients that contribute to them going back to jail and prison over and over again. And I'm going to weave in a lot of interventions through this literature too. These are some of the neurological, the biological, and the psychological factors that are talked about in the neurocriminology literature. We are going to talk about a lot of these again. Most of my research focuses on fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. We're going to talk about prenatal drug and alcohol and tobacco exposure and why that is so important for you to consider that even when working with adult clients. What about this one here? Environmental contaminants. Think about this. Have you ever worked with a client that's had a very long history of being homeless, living in poverty? Maybe they lived in a really run-down environment, and in that environment, they were exposed to a lot of environmental contaminants, maybe lead, maybe mercury. Do you have a client that lives right across the street from a factory or a busy freeway? There is evidence to support the fact that air pollution exposure may be a factor to consider in one variable of many that contributes to criminal behavior. So a lot of different things we're going to cover in here. And again, Michael, interrupt me anytime if anyone has any thoughts, questions, concerns, or anything folks just want to add to the discussion. I welcome that. So we're going to start with prenatal factors first. So I don't want to lose you here. This is so important to understand, even if you're working with older adults, because a lot of these things started in utero. If you truly want to understand the prenatal world and early childhood kind of risk factors that could be potential variables as to why your clients now today maybe have a lot of issues, I am a big fan of the first 1,000 days of life research literature. Basically what this is it focuses on day 1 of conception in utero all the way up to age 2. And what this research says is that we need to pay particular attention what was going on during that span. Exposure to trauma. What was mom's nutritional habits like? There was a case I consulted on several years ago. This is one of the most extreme cases I consulted on, but this is a perfect example how this research plays out. The case was a mom was pregnant, using meth, using drugs. She was in a domestic violence situation. She was dealing with a lot of stress, lots of trauma. And after her child was born and became older, this child started acting out behaviorally in school. These behaviors started to progress as the child got a little bit older. They got labeled with all kinds of diagnoses, thrown into special education. They were medicated. They started hanging out with individuals that may not have had their best intentions in mind. As the person became a teenager, they started to steal, use drugs, get into fights, and as they became an adult, they were in and out of jail and prison. What happens if we could have gone back in time and educated all the providers that were in that person's life, in that mom's life at that time, including the school teachers, to really understand the role and impact that trauma plays? Not just trauma from like domestic violence, but in utero trauma, nutritional deficiencies, exposures to drugs, alcohol, things of that nature. That is just one case of many. And I'll talk about a lot of cases I've consulted on throughout this series as well. So whatever mom is dealing with during pregnancy obviously impacts that developing child in utero. And there is some evidence that supports the fact that women who go through pregnancy under a high degree of stress, maybe it's because they're in a really tough situation, they're in a domestic violence situation. In some cases, all of the stress that mom's dealing with gets carried over to that developing child in utero and may have a profound impact on their brain and body. And in some cases, it could contribute to that adolescent as they get older to have a fearless temperament. Why do you want to care about this? Because have you ever worked with a client who doesn't seem to have a fear response? They just seem to not care about rules. They seem to not be afraid of getting arrested. That could be linked with early childhood fearlessness. That is a red flag indicator for targeted intervention, because if people aren't afraid, consequences as usual probably don't do much for these people. And then a lot of times they're in and out of jail, in and out of prison over and over and over again. It's called fearless temperament. And this can be triggered by all kinds of things, not just stress, but prenatal drug and alcohol exposure as well. A lot of times people think attachment begins after the child is born. There are numerous studies that talk about attachment starts in utero. When you think about this research, if you've ever worked with females who are pregnant and they're in like jail or prison, there's actually research that talks about prenatal incarceration exposure. So a mom's in prison and she's pregnant. That can contribute to adverse outcomes in and of itself. What happens if the pregnancy, unfortunately, was a result of a sexual assault, or the mom just does not want to be pregnant? These can impact attachment patterns before that child's even born. There is plenty of evidence to support the fact that all of you who are doing this good work should learn about attachment theory, because clients that you work with, especially if they're in and out of jail, in and out of prison, there's a higher likelihood that they have fractured attachment patterns. And fractured attachment patterns can happen as a result of growing up in an environment where there's a lot of abuse, chaos, or even in environments where there's a lot of neglect or lots of emotional invalidation, just to name a few. What happens if dad is dealing with a high degree of criminality? So mom's pregnant, dad's in the house, dad is in and out of jail, in and out of prison. The stress related to that has been linked with preterm birth. And by no means am I saying if a child is born prematurely, they're going to grow up and commit criminal behavior. But you will find in the neurocriminology literature that this is something to take into account that could be a factor in some cases of future criminality. Preterm birth could be related to high levels of stress during pregnancy, malnutrition, even direct heat exposure has been linked with more preterm birth. So like a mom is pregnant and living in an environment where it's just so hot, that has also been linked to it. So this is another factor to take into account. If you have access to your clients' early childhood records, if appropriate, or even birth records, that can provide you with a wealth of data that might be used to help develop a more informed intervention plan for some of these complex clients. What happens if there was no violence in the home, but there was a lot of violence in the community? So we also have to think of what kind of community violence exposure your client was exposed to at various points in life. Community violence, maybe living in a neighborhood where there's a lot of police contact, lots of just poverty, homelessness, racial discriminations. Maybe there's breakdowns in relationships between the community and government officials. Community violence is a type of adverse childhood experience. This is another variable, I think, to consider in the discussion that we're having today. Violence exposure, again, whatever happens to mom during pregnancy gets carried over to that child in utero. So any kind of violence that's being perpetrated during pregnancy obviously is a very important target area for intervention. We all know this, it's common sense, but it is a very good reminder that we need to take this into account. Michael, I'm getting a little background noise. I don't know if you're getting that.
Wait, I'll put my headphones in. Hold on, guys.
Hold on, everyone should be muted. Let's make sure that we're all on mute, please.
Michael, maybe that's a good time for me to park the brakes just for a second and see if there's any thoughts, questions, concerns on any of those slides I've covered so far. And if not, no worries, we'll just keep rocking and rolling. And Michael, you can hear me okay still?
You are loud and clear. Thank you very much.
Yep, you bet. How does racism fall into this? This is another big factor we need to take into account. What kind of experiences of racism has your client dealt with? Historical trauma, health disparities, structural kinds of issues, housing disparities, all these things can absolutely play a role in future problematic behavior if that person hasn't had proper supports, services, or interventions. What about stigma? We know from the research literature, working with folks who've been in prison typically deal with a higher level of stigma once released. That is a very important target area for intervention. And if you can identify the stigmas that they're dealing with and help them maybe reduce their level of shame. Maybe they're dealing with some high level of shame because shame's a very toxic emotion. Is your client dealing with some level of feeling really helpless or hopeless, or do they just feel really isolated from the world and they don't have a good social network? These are all things to really consider because these are huge barriers for that client being successful on probation or parole, and it can be a huge accelerant for that client possibly going and committing additional offenses. A lot of times technical violations, maybe it's relapse on drugs and alcohol. But the takeaway point from this is be aware that racism experiences need to be considered. High levels of health disparities are very common. We'll talk about that more. And also taking into account the role that stigma plays, because again, this can trickle down and contribute to higher levels of hopelessness, helplessness, shame, and isolation, just to name a few in your clients. Now, this is a huge topic we need to be aware of because unfortunately, the research is pretty clear on this. This is quite common in the general population, but when we start looking at incarcerated populations, the number of individuals who are in prison, who've been exposed to substances in utero, is actually significantly higher than the general population. If you work with clients that have had a long history of being in like child welfare, termination of parental rights histories, things like that, be on the lookout too for just patterns associated with this. We really need to look at it through this lens because when a client has been exposed to any kind of substances in utero, prenatal, drug, alcohol, even tobacco exposure, there's an increased likelihood that that client, when they're an adult or a teenager, is probably going to have more mental health challenges. This has been linked with more sleep problems, higher levels of irritability, more learning deficits, more language problems. All of these things are huge barriers for that client to be successful in whatever environment they're in. So this is a big thing. The takeaway point here is that you probably are coming into contact with clients who've been exposed to substances in utero on a semi-regular basis. But the overwhelming majority of cases in my experience, and according to the research literature, have never been identified as been exposed to these substances because it's not on the radar of a lot of professionals. What happens if you suspect the client has had a prenatal substance use exposure history, but you can't confirm it 100%? No big deal in my opinion, because if you use the interventions we're going to talk about today, that can be good for anyone, regardless if it was in utero trauma or early childhood trauma. Smoking, people don't think about this. In my experience, most clients like with serious mental health challenges, an elevated number of clients that have had long histories of being involved in the criminal justice system do have smoking histories. If any of you are working in substance use treatment, this is a big issue as well. And a lot of times when I give talks on this, sometimes I get pushback that, why should we care about tobacco? Just as long as the client's not using drugs or alcohol. Well, I think there's a very strong argument to be made, and the research does support this, that this is a huge factor as well that we need to take into account in the criminality discussion. So targeting this as an intervention may be really helpful. If you work with clients who are smoking cigarettes, if there's anything you can do to help them cut down or quit, that will not only probably play a role in helping improve their physical health and hopefully their finances, but it's actually been linked with improvements in mental health. It can help reduce impulse control issues, and the list goes on. So targeting smoking prevention kinds of interventions would be highly recommended as well. I just point this out again, some of these topics are big. We don't think about them a lot, but take a look at this. This is just a good reminder. Lead exposure is actually a major factor talked about in the criminality literature that could contribute to future aggression and violent behavior. If you've ever worked with clients with a long history, again, of homelessness, maybe they're living in sheltered environments, living in really rundown situations, the home is just really old, never taken care of, or depending on maybe the client has lived in communities where that community was really old and most of the houses were built hundreds of years ago. Be suspicious. I'm not saying every client was exposed to lead, but the research points to the fact that a high percentage of people in the United States in general may have had some lead exposure histories. And if you're working with criminal justice involved populations with a longer history of just living in just really tough situations, this is another factor you might want to take into account that could contribute to some of these problematic behaviors you may be seeing. I don't want to lose you here, but this is another variable to take into account that we don't think about. There is more research that's been published now on this that talks about excessive sugar consumption may actually be a factor to consider as well as it pertains to aggressive, violent, and problematic behavior. I've actually done multiple podcasts now on this topic. And when I started digging into this topic a couple years ago, I was just really shocked that how many studies have been done on this that talk about this could play a role in criminality in some cases. Prenatal sugar exposure we need to take into account, but the reason why I became interested in this topic is the fact that so many cases I've consulted on over the years, the client seemed to have a really problematic relationship with sugar. They just pounded down the energy drinks. They consumed a high amount of fast food and processed food and gas station food. And this is a major factor to take into account. I've done enough work with enough group homes and treatment settings that I know that a high percentage of these clients love their sweets. They love their sodas. This is a factor that can absolutely play into problematic behavior. Now, I'm not asking any of you to go out and like set up a nutrition plan with a client or anything like that, but what I would recommend or suggest, maybe consider referring your client to a qualified healthcare professional or a licensed nutritionist where they could focus on this, because there are several studies that talk about nutritional interventions as playing a huge role in combating future criminal behavior. Malnutrition, food insecurity, all of these things. We'll talk a lot more about this in that last training in this series. But what happens if your client growing up lived in a home, lots of neglect, lots of poverty, they didn't have access to good food, malnutrition early on in childhood or in utero has been linked with problematic outcomes later on in life. And some studies point to the fact that it actually could be a risk factor for having later addictive behavior tendencies. So if you're working in substance use treatment programs, or you're a licensed alcohol and drug counselor, you'd probably do quite well learning about this literature because it could play a role in helping develop a more specialized intervention plan for your clients that have some addictive tendencies. So just some things to think about that maybe we don't consider in this discussion. And again, I'll talk about nutrition several times out, but I'm not advocating for you to set up any kind of nutrition plan, but I just want to point out some of the research has pointed to the fact that nutritional deficiencies in utero early on in life or even in adulthood could play a partial role in antisocial or problematic behavior. The reason why that is, clients that don't eat well are probably not getting the right kinds of nutrients. Poor eating habits have been linked with more digestive health issues. We'll talk about the gut-brain health axis in this series a few times. People that don't eat well typically have problems with blood sugar dysregulation, and blood sugar dysregulation has been linked with more mental health problems, more self-control deficits, an increased likelihood of relapsing on drugs and alcohol. These are really important things to consider when we're thinking about this through a biological lens. So again, we talked about prenatal stress exposure, but I wanted to point this out, the amygdala. This is something I'm sure all of you are dealing with clients all the time, but I want to put a name to it. Amygdala dysfunction in the criminology literature is talked about as a factor for violent behavior in some cases. So if you ever work with someone that has amygdala dysfunction, that's a part of the brain, it's part of the limbic system of the brain. And why should you care about this? Because if a client has deficits in the area of the amygdala, they might have an unusual fear response. So they might get more fearful. They might be more prone to have panic attacks. Amygdala dysfunction has also been linked with clients struggling to read facial cues in other people. So they may misread your facial cues and thinking that you're upset with them when in fact you're not. This plays a critical role in emotional regulation. So amygdala dysfunction oftentimes equates to emotional functioning problems, and most people that go to prison probably go there on some level because there's some emotional dysregulation going on, which is linked to anger control problems, drug issues, rage control problems, all kinds of things. So that's a huge, just a brief overview of the amygdala. Poverty, socioeconomic status, we know unfortunately from the research that economic hardship is actually very, very common among the clients we serve, particularly if it's people that have been to prison. And if you're working with clients that have true economic hardship, that's been linked with higher levels of food insecurity. So they may not have enough money to eat healthy foods. They can have a really difficult time finding safe and affordable housing. If you work with parents who are trying to reconnect with their kids, high levels of economic hardship have been linked with having more parenting practice issues. These factors have also been linked with more social isolation, which can be a huge factor for relapse on drugs and alcohol, and it could potentially increase your client's mental health issues. Economic hardship has also been linked with having more conflict resolution issues and sleep-related problems, just to name a few. So taking into account if you work with clients that have had a long-standing pattern of not having a lot of money, not a lot of resources, maybe it's very poor credit, maybe they've never had a car, looking at their employment history, this is a really good thing for us to just be reminded of. Prenatal anxiety exposure, another thing. Interestingly, again, moms going through pregnancy, dealing with a high level of anxiety during pregnancy, that in some cases could contribute to your client having a difficult temperament or more behavioral or emotional problems and more hyperactivity issues. This has sometimes been related to your client maybe being at an increased risk of being diagnosed with ADHD or conduct disorder or some other behavioral problems later on in life. So a lot of the things you may be seeing in your clients right now, a lot of times may be beyond their control in some cases that happened to them before they were born. But the research says if you can still target these things, even as adults, things can get better. Educating clients about these things can actually help them reduce shame and feel better and help them realize why they may have these behavioral reactions. And then you can develop services, support strategies, and interventions that maybe help that client handle more stressful situations more effectively in the future. So I mentioned this briefly before, but if you've ever worked with a mom who's pregnant and gave birth during incarceration, prenatal incarceration exposure could be a major factor to also consider as it pertains to problematic health outcomes. Now, I'm sure as adults, when you work with adult clients, a lot of them maybe have had some histories of parental incarceration. Just looking at that in general, parental incarceration is a type of adverse childhood experience, and parental incarceration obviously disrupts the whole family system, which it puts more stress and strain economically on that family system. And it's been linked with having more antisocial behaviors in kids who've lived in those environments, more suspensions in school, and more mental health challenges, just to name a few.
This video is brought to you by Ramsey County Social Services and was made possible by a Mental Health Innovations grant. Thank you.